It's episode 190 of the Security Weekly News and the Security Weekly Wrap-Up Show for the week of 20 February 2022. We've got Disney Adventures, Sandworm, Cyclops Blink, Armageddon, Electron Bot, Airtags, SockDetour, and more, along with all the show wrap-ups on the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more. Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
All right, I'm Doug White, and this is the Security Weekly News Wrap-Up Show. On Application Security Weekly number 185, John and Mike first talked about, it was a cool segment actually, how to build a web hacking setup. So you can have tools, targets, and all this kind of stuff that you may want. And this was really kind of an extension of a webcast we did recently called, Do It Yourself Building a Security Lab at Home. And a lot of people ask about these kind of questions. And so this was a segment where they talked about building a very specific kind of lab setup just for like AppSec. So if that's something you're interested in, you should definitely check that segment out. In the second segment, they had the AppSec news. On Business Security Weekly number 251, Ben, Matt, and Tyler discussed a new title that has been showing up called the Business Information Security Officer, or BISO. Which was actually news to me. I had not encountered that title before, but I actually know what it is. Once I looked at what they were talking about, I was like, oh, that. They basically were talking about how this role works, and this is a kind of non-technical role that's acting as sort of an intermediary between, and I used to do this kind of stuff too, was talking to both sides of the table, so talking to management about security tech type stuff, but not really being a technical thing. So they were talking about how these sort of non-technical positions may fit in and how they function in the organization. They did some things about where this should sit in the org chart, and and should it be something that interests you as a CISO or as an up-and-comer? Is this part of your career path and so forth? And in the second segment, the business security news. On Enterprise Security Weekly 262, Adrian Cady, Lee, and Tyler Shields had Jimmy Vo, detection engineer at Datadog, on the show. I love Datadog, is one of my favorite company names. But Jimmy was on to talk about his experience as a very traditional banking detection engineer and how he now kind of got sucked into this world of cloud-first startups, which is a very different kind of thing. And it was an interesting discussion about how the world has changed, and we have serverless, and we have all these kind of new things that are going on, and how traditional engineers may work in that world. And in the second segment, Brian Peterson, the ICS for ICS program manager, say that real fast 3 times. He's also Brian is also the ISA GCA advocacy program manager and the Logic LOGIC program manager at the International Society of Automation. So alphabet soup. But Brian was on to talk about incident, what the ICS for ICS stuff is, which is incident command systems for industrial control systems. ICS for ICS. Brian was talking about how this enables companies to work with government agencies and so forth when there are cyber impacts that are occurring across a sector or within a sector. Very, sort of interesting discussion, and starting to see things from the disaster world being applied to ICS. So definitely worth checking out if you're dealing with any of that. In the third segment, they had the enterprise security news. On Security Weekly News, number 189, Jason Wood was back to talk about a speech that was made by Lisa Monaco, who is the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And that there was a speech that Lisa made that was about how their new policy is going to be attack cyber criminals first and ask questions later. So this was back into that realm of what they call hacking back, which has always been kind of controversial. And for a long time, the policy was you don't do that. But it sounds like maybe they're starting to look at that in a different way. On Paul's Security Weekly, number 729, first up was the security news. On the second segment, Chris Sistrunk, the technical manager for ICS OT at Mandiant, was on the show. More ICS stuff. So this is definitely becoming a big deal because of infrastructure and so forth. Chris was talking about how, as an electrical engineer, he got drawn into the InfoSec and told a bunch of war stories about the kind of things he's seen in that realm. They took viewer questions as well. And in the third segment, Josh Corman, the founder of I Am the Cavalry and recently chief strategist for the CISA COVID task force at I Am the Cavalry. I always had trouble saying that word, but was on to talk about working for CISA, being a Fed, and stories from the front line. So quite an interesting person indeed. Well, my threat of the week is going to be Russia. Sorry, Russian friends. And yes, I do have Russian friends. But I'm actually wanting to talk about Russian cyber war, or just cyber war in general. Think about, there's an old episode of the original series. Do I need to say what the original series was? I doubt it. A Taste of Armageddon. That was what I was thinking about when I was reading about all this and being asked questions about this all week. The original series being, of course, Star Trek. There was an original series in that episode called A Taste of Armageddon. There was a computer that just determined when everybody died, and then they went over and reported to the disintegration chamber, and Kirk and Spock, spoiler alert, get tagged as dead, and they're supposed to report and be, eliminated because the computer, they're avoiding like an actual nuclear war. I don't want to get into the geopolitical realm because I don't know that much about it. I know there's all these Twitter experts on all this stuff, just like there were Twitter experts on viruses and whatnot. But, and there was all this Cold War stuff and whatever. But it did make me think about some of this. And I had a lot of student questions this week, surprisingly enough. That were these almost like anxiety questions about what all this means. And this was all about the cyber side of it. All my life, in the Stone Age, the Cold War was going on, and I personally grew up within 25 miles of a Class A target that was going to literally be hit with a massive nuclear strike if the war broke out, and was a primary target, first wave, all this kind of stuff. And I always kind of identified as Russia was this malevolent bad guy that was sitting somewhere behind this thing called the Iron Curtain, which I didn't really understand when I was a kid. And we were all just sort of waiting for this, the end to arrive. I mean, literally. I mean, we had, training in school where they're just basically telling you go, huddle under your desks while, waiting on the nuclear weapons to hit. And, and of course, we were always told that Russia was just waiting for the moment they could launch global thermonuclear war and wipe us all out. But it didn't happen. I mean, I think it got close a couple of times that we know about. I mean, there certainly was the Cuban Missile Crisis and a couple other famous incidents, but it probably also means that it got a lot closer than that some other times that we don't know about that are, locked in a presidential seal folder somewhere. But I mean, Russia and the U.S. are both still sitting on huge piles of kinetic warfare nukes that would basically wipe out the whole planet if they were used and turn us all into a rapidly expanding dust cloud. But that's not our purpose here. I think the real threat and the new Cold War is the threat of cyber warfare that we are not even close to being ready to deal with. Russia decided that they're going to, test the waters and invade the Ukraine again this week. and I've seen all these warnings about Russian attacks via the internet. And I saw warnings saying that infrastructure is being targeted, that schools are being targeted, hospitals, you name it, being targeted. And a lot of students at the university were asking questions about, like, are they going to see attacks on their accounts at the bank or at school or whatnot? And my answer was, yeah, it's possible. I mean, you think about the investment that countries have been making in cyber, and you think about the investment we made in the Cold War. I mean, we spent trillions of dollars investing in nukes and tanks and aircraft and all this stuff, the Dr. Strangelove kind of world. But we haven't really invested even a fraction of that on the cyber side. I mean, it's not been that many years since I had a person with stars on their shoulders telling me all this cyber stuff's a bunch of crap. If it's a problem, we'll just take a hellfire bomb and the problem will be solved. And I was thinking, yeah, I don't think that that's going to be the world that we're living in. And it is rapidly evolving and emerging that is indeed the case. Think about Poland. I mean, Poland's this wonderful, beautiful country. Unfortunately, it just happens to sit between some other countries like Germany and Russia that have had this bad tendency throughout history to kind of, invade. Here's this beautiful verdant land with lots of food and it's pretty. Maybe we could just sort of go in there. And, the Ukraine has all these nice ports and things that are really useful. And the U.S. has never had that problem. We were sitting between two oceans, and to our north were the rabid Canadians, always just foaming at the mouth, ready to invade, and to the south were the ever warlike Mexicans. Yeah. So we've never really had to worry about that. I mean, it's a real different thing to defend, against the sky and the sea. But when you've got all that space in between you, it's a long way between Europe and Long Island to try and invade. So we've not really dealt with that. But the cyberspace world suddenly meant that everybody and everything from the Mayberry Sheriff's Office to Rudy Giuliani's office in Manhattan is on the front lines. And our schools, our hospitals, all that stuff is sitting out there running code from 50 years ago. And, the Mayberry Sheriff's Office is probably online, and they're probably running really antiquated stuff. And, maybe 50-year-old code even is sitting there being run. And we have certainly not spent trillions of dollars trying to shore it up like we did in the Cold War. It's kind of the opposite. Thousands of municipalities and other entities, all with unique and ancient crumbling code, are all suddenly, not an ocean away, but literally sitting on the front lines, and they have no support. They have no updates, and, we're still building hellfire bombs. And I'm not trying to get into some whole geopolitical, debate about weapons and whatnot. But a student asked me if their bank account was safe from attack. And my response was probably not. The 101st WordPress Assault Battalion is somewhere polishing up their keyboards to go in. And, are my passwords safe from being harvested off of MrFufu.com? Doubtful. And, some nameless building in St. Petersburg, there's a fresh-faced 20-year-old soldier harvesting all those passwords from the dark web as we speak, if they hadn't done it already. And they're sitting there readying their botnets to spring into action. Now, former President Donald Trump was really, really big on building a wall on the Mexican border. And again, we won't get into that. But I personally think we probably should be investing in building firewalls to keep Fancy Bear out and to keep some 12-year-old kid in Minsk from attacking the traffic signal network in New York, or that power plant that's running the machine I'm typing this on, And I'm not one for hyperbole. I know I seem that way, but I'm really not. But, and I'm not ready to run for the virtual bomb shelter with a Bible, a Rita Hayworth poster, and a shotgun just yet. But I did spend a lot of time building exercises that focused on what was going to happen when critical infrastructure is eliminated. And we didn't really look at it in the form of cyber war as much as we looked at it in the form of natural disaster and or terrorist attacks. But let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. When that stuff happened, I don't know, where we go from there. And when these sanctions kick in, maybe Putin is just, got the 82nd Airborne Python coding squad to turn off the lights or spell out Biden sucks on the big board in Times Square or something like that. Or maybe they just clean out everybody's bank account and let, economic chaos ensue for the West. So far, it seems like they've mostly just been doing good old, this tank is about to blow your head off, boy, kind of kinetic warfare that everybody's been, planning for and dealing with for pretty much since cave people were like, I could throw this rock at my neighbor and then I'd have 2 caves. But they definitely were out there doing that. And then there's the whole targeting of Ukrainian resources and cyber attacks. We got a couple of stories this week about just that. But, in the modern age, borders aren't really a thing. So they may well attack Dust, Colorado in the next round. And, I don't know how that evolves, but it's awfully complicated. So I do think we've been moving slowly towards more focus on cyber from a military perspective, but it's going to take a lot more resources that are focused in that direction and a lot more people in Washington that are willing to understand and deal with cyber if we're going to actually deal with it effectively. So I guess we'll see. Who knows? Maybe next week we'll be doing the news with a heliograph or something. Anyway, and now the news. So Electron Bot is a Trojan that can be found on the Microsoft App Store, literally. They've been hiding this bot in a lot of popular software that they have cloned. And you remember on Tuesday I was talking about the Star Trek Trojan that on my old BBS system. Well, this is the same kind of thing, and this Electron Bot has been found, among other things, in Temple Run and Subway Surfer, which are apparently 2 of the most popular games on the Microsoft App Store. I've never played either one of them, which is a good thing, I guess, at this point. Checkpoint said that this malware has already scored over 5,000 victims in 20 different countries. According to the report, there's dozens of games and other apps that are compromised with this particular bot on the Microsoft Store. Microsoft said, and you're going to love this quote, "We are investigating and we will take appropriate action." So very conclusive there. The bot has been described as a modular SEO poisoning malware. So this bot basically uses the local machine as a base of operation to do SEO type attacks, which basically means they're running up malicious sites on search indices. And they also use this as a click bot so that it will be on your system and it is basically clicking on and accessing things that they want it to do in order to run this up the search index. And so that's what SEO poisoning is, of course. It would appear that the initiative is the SEO as a service rather than some direct attack. So they're basically selling a service to push your site up the search index so that it comes up first. And a lot of those apparently were also malicious. So I've got a malicious site for phishing or whatever. I pay these guys to actually embed this in their clickbot attacks, and that drives my site up the site. So this is kind of the equivalent of fake reviews. So I don't know if you've ever seen those. I was looking at some reviews the other day, and I noticed that every single review used some of the same language. The word easy peasy, which is a kind of annoying, kind of phrase in English. And I noticed that there were like dozens of reviews on there where it somewhere in the review it used easy peasy. So I figured it was probably a bot that somebody who didn't really speak English probably put together. There is a darker side to this malware, of course. This malware compromises your social media accounts and then also starts clicking and promoting news and or other stories that I guess they're being paid to promote. So this is a way that something gets a lot of likes by using this sort of back office botnet. Apparently, this thing's been around since about 2018, and it was originally found in the App Store back then, but it's been continually revised and enhanced since then. It's built on Electron, hence the name, and if you don't know what Electron is, it's an open source framework for desktop apps. The payloads may continue to be modded and updated remotely after the infection. So Checkpoint said most of the actions currently are not high risk, but it could easily be used to take over the device or do a lot more nefarious things. So there's a lot of details about this in the article if you're interested in it. Apple Airtags have had a tough time since they were introduced. A lot like Tile and other things. People have used them for good and evil, but apparently a lot of the bad press for Apple AirTags was that people were using them to track people. So dropping them in somebody's pocket in a club or in their bag or whatever allowed you to then turn around and track that person, despite what they said that it couldn't be used that way. The AirTag was introduced in 2021, and it has now been compromised again. This particular article covers a lot of the sort of background behind how that was done, including jailbreaking AirTags and reports that a researcher called Limited Results was able to manipulate the chip. And by doing that, they could force it to reboot with debugging enabled. That was one of the early attacks. That pretty much allowed you to do all sorts of things to AirTag. And another researcher named Ghidra Ninja was able to dump the firmware, mod it, and then re-upload it onto the AirTag, which essentially created a jailbroken AirTag. There's a lot of details about those. Those are older situations. But Ghidra basically changed the pointer in there, and so instead of it pointing to found.apple.com, it could point to a different site, which then once it went there, it played Never Gonna Give You Up. Yeah, really. So, you got rickrolled by your AirTag. But then they go on, and they started documenting Fabian Bronlund, who was originally able to use a Bluetooth system on a chip that allowed it to push out messages from the AirTag to iPhones that were nearby and get free messaging being sent. It was a very low bandwidth thing, but they were able to do that. And ultimately, Fabian was able to use this to create a low bandwidth messaging system that would hand off messages to any iPhones that were passing by, since the AirTag was supposed to do this, right? And that was part of how it was tracked. Apple had that all locked down with encryption and so forth, but people have been able to get around it. And Fabian was able to get the Apple network to relay and store the anonymized messages. So using this, this was the old stuff. So now Bronlund's back and has a new system where a bogus message trick can be used again. This particular one's called Find You, and it basically is a proof of concept that the anti-Find You features in the AirTag, which is called Tracker Detect, can be circumvented. According to Apple, you and only you, the owner, can track the tag, but alas, Fabian was able to create a full-blown experiment that showed a method that would let you track the tags without tipping off Apple's anti-detection stuff. And all the details of that are in the article, so if you want to read about it or see how, they had really low-level details. It's all very passive, so it's pretty hard to detect, but Fabian did recommend a free app, which always makes me nervous, but a free app called AirGuard, that would show you any AirTags that are around you and or pseudo AirTags that were nearby, so you could kind of see if somebody was tracking you. So you could put that on your device and you could see this, this tag seems to be following me around. It does only work on Android though, so I guess Apple wouldn't put that in their Apple store. And here it comes. In the Ukraine, you knew we were going to get there somewhere. In the Ukraine, data wiper attacks were being deployed this week, just before the kinetic war invasion started. A wiper that was written in Golang was part of they believe anyway, it was part of the kinetic invasion strategy that was being used. So this is sort of the cyber war component of this. In some of the attacks, there was ransomware, but apparently the ransomware was just a distraction. So the wiper was being deployed, and all that was being reported by Symantec. The wiper is called Hermetic Wiper, and it was named that by Sentinel-1 researcher Juan Andres Guerrero Seda, and it was dropped all over the Ukraine yesterday, as well as being dropped in Lithuania and Latvia. That may have just been it spreading, to people that had similar language backgrounds and so forth. But the targets were finance and government components. And, and Latvia and Lithuania were the ones that were mostly reporting this, but it was apparently heavily targeted in the Ukraine. The software had a compile date of 28 December 2021, which would imply this was part of the prep for the kinetic war. The wiper corrupts the files, trashes the master boot record, and then reboots the computer, which means it's not going to work anymore. So, and apparently the ransomware was being used as a distraction while the wiper was running in the background. It did have a ransom note, but the emails and things on the ransom note didn't seem to actually pan out. So it doesn't look like there was an actual ransomware end game. It was more of just like, we're going to throw this out there to keep you, occupied trying to figure out what's being ransomware while these wipers run. Symantec found evidence the attackers had gained access to the network well in advance via Exchange vulnerabilities late last year, and then installed web shells and other mechanisms which would allow them to get back in later, even if the Exchange vulnerabilities were patched. So So, these type of wipers have been used by Russian hacker groups in the past. There has not been any attribution of the attacks in the Ukraine so far to Russia, but considering that there's Russian tanks shelling the place, it's probably a good bet that Russian hacker groups were the ones behind this. A new malware called SockDetour has been found on U.S. defense contractor systems and provides a backdoor which would allow access to the networks that have been compromised. Unit 42 spotted this approach, and they said that this may have been being used as early as July 2019. So again, we're seeing a lot of this cyber warfare stuff in the background early. So people are planning. So if they need to go to war, they're going to have this stuff ready to roll. So they're putting in backdoors and Trojans embedded in stuff, very hidden and very subtle. This particular malware called SockDetour is socketless. I think that's where the name came from. And it's really, really hard to detect. It's serverless, socketless kind of stuff. It's just a really subtle way that leaves you a backdoor into a network that is part of a connection hijack in the Microsoft Detours library. And if you don't know that library, it's part of the Windows API call monitoring and instrumentation library. And it seems these attacks are part of an APT called Tilted Temple. And they have been linked to other attacks as well, and they seem to be linked to China. So this is a really subtle way to ensure that if your actions are detected, like some of the stuff you're doing gets detected, there's still this sort of back-end way to get back into the system after they clean up, so you can always get back in. So it's a really handy way to do things, and I always like these kind of subtle things, although this stuff's pretty scary. Unit 42 spotted this at least one U.S. defense contractor on 27 July 2021, and since then they found that 4 other defense organizations were being targeted by the same group using the very same approach, and at least one of those was compromised as well. In one of the reported cases, they used a QNAP NAS, which we've reported on before, and they used the exploit on that to get access to the server, but other techniques are being used as well, so be cautious. A joint advisory was issued by CISA, the FBI, the U.S. Cyber National Mission Force, the UK National Cybersecurity Center, and the NSA today that was regarding a group called Muddy Water, which apparently is an Iranian-backed APT. So the report says that Muddy Water is targeting a range of government and private sector organizations, including telcos, defense, local governments, oil and natural gas, pretty much all over the world. The group is using PowGoop, Canopy Star Whale, Mori, PowerStats, and other malware as a launching point for second stage malware, which would introduce backdoors into all these networks. So in the report, the malware has been called Small Sieve, and it is a Python backdoor that has been used to establish access, and another PowerShell backdoor that is being used to encrypt command and control communications with the C2 server. So nation states are starting to do this and get this subtle idea that it would be a good idea to have a way into these networks, if that country invades you or if you, decide to take that country out. And so they're all starting to set this stuff up, which is really, really scary. Cyclops Blink is another new malware that's being linked to Sandworm, which, you guessed it, is a Russian-backed APT hacking group that, according to the same CISA release with all those other people, in that previous story, is using it. Apparently, this malware is being used as a replacement for the VPN filter malware that was found in 2018 that was allowing Sandworm to remotely access networks. According to the report, the deployment is indiscriminate and widespread. So they're basically just anybody they can get into, they're getting into. This Cyclops Blink malware specifically targets WatchGuard, Firebox, and other Soho devices. So this is more of a low-end thing to get into end users and home, small businesses, and things like that. WatchGuard said that the Cyclops Blink malware may have affected 1% of all active WatchGuard firewall appliances. And the CISA report says that it seems to primarily target WatchGuard, but there's no reason to believe they can't recompile it for other architectures and firmware. The malware does use legitimate firmware update channels to maintain access and then can inject repackaged firmware images onto these devices. WatchGuard does provide tooling and guidance help to detect and remove this type of malware. So if you're using that equipment, you may want to get something and run it and see where you are. And a lot of this stuff is subtle. So we've gone a long way from the old days of somebody taking over your network and putting up a funny picture on your website to people trying to plan for long time horizon ability to get into networks when and if they need to do so. So this seems to be the emerging cyber warfare model. Finally, apparently Disney decided that fans would do just about anything for the Star Wars universe, and so they created a 2-day resort immersive theme park experience at Disney that claims to immerse you in living on a Star Wars battle cruiser called, and it's called Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser experience, and it's about, for 2 people, it was $5,000. And I don't really know if that's a lot or a little. I mean, it sounds like a lot to me, but Disney's, kind of one of those things that I don't have a lot of experience with. For 4 people, it was up, around $6,000 for 2 days. They basically put out some videos of the experience last year, which showed something like one of their sort of line queuing areas, which we've all probably stood in at some point or the other, with the screens and the fake, stuff. And they got a lot of bad flack over it. People were making fun of it and so forth, and the videos seem to have disappeared. But despite the price, the writer of the article said that when it does open officially next week, it was pretty cool. The writer got to visit it on a media tour. I guess my invitation got lost in the mail. Hey, Disney, you want a good review? Keep us all in mind. But is Mr. Disney available? But apparently it's a lot like immersive theater, from what I can say, like Sleep No More, if you've ever been to that in New York, or they run that other places too. But you do get assigned a part to play, and it sounds kind of stupid at first, but it's actually pretty fun. I've done a couple of those, and I had a good time. In this case, they basically give you an iPhone 12 mini that looks like some kind of, communications device that's got your particular running story on it, and it basically guides your interactions with other people. The one I went to, one of the ones I went to in Brooklyn, basically said they handed out little slips of paper when you were standing in the queue to get in, and mine basically said my job tonight was to find someone and get married. Which was pretty cool. I mean, at first I was like, "This is stupid," but then it was kind of fun, and I actually ended up winning this nice young person playing cards with an actor who was being Boss Tweed from the 5 Points back in the 19th century. It was fun, but the Disney one, expensive, but it does sound like fun to me. So maybe Disney will invite me to review it. Who knows? Or they'll send some Disney thugs over to ensure I say nice things with my legs broken. Anyway, that's the wrap up for the week of 20 February 2022. I'm Doug White. See you next week on the Security Weekly News.